Welcome to episode number 102 of the Living While Loving Your Child Through Addiction podcast, formerly known as Living with Your Child's Addiction. Here, we focus on self care as we tend to our own lives while also extending love and compassion to our kids. This podcast offers science backed skills to bring hope and healing to your entire family. I'm always telling parents to practice acceptance, but that is a tall order and a process rather than a destination. So I wanted to make sure to do an episode that you can listen to every time you feel like you need acceptance. I'm also adding another episode today that is a meditation about acceptance. So you can use this episode along with the meditation to help you with your acceptance. The reason I chose to do a meditation on this subject is because there is nothing that can replace the stillness of being with something that you're trying to process. Meditation is a powerful tool that is often overlooked because if we aren't used to it, it's uncomfortable and there's fear of doing it wrong. Just doing it is the key, though. I made the meditation intentionally short, it's less than 10 minutes to make it easier for you to try. Before I go into the details of finding acceptance and how to do that, I want to set the expectation that acceptance rarely happens without intention in a situation like your child's addiction because it's the opposite of everything you expected to happen and the opposite of what you want. So it makes sense that acceptance is going to take work, that it's not going to just happen to you. I want you to expect to work at it. And if you think that you have acceptance, then I want you to ask yourself if your life reflects that you have acceptance. Because sometimes people will say to me that they're fine with something when they really aren't. And I can tell by the way that they're talking about it. So ask yourself that question. Does your life and how you feel on a daily basis reflect acceptance? Some ways that acceptance might be reflected in your life, not all, just some, are that you often feel peaceful, you're functioning in your daily life, you're able to focus, you're able to get your work done, you're able to spend time with friends and to make decisions and keep moving forward. So please listen to this episode with the intention that acceptance is a practice you acknowledge you will have to work at. In this episode, I'm going to cover one, the definition of acceptance, two, why acceptance is critical, and three steps to move forward or move toward acceptance. Before I do that, I would like to ask you to subscribe to the podcast, rate it, and review it. In the last year, the podcast has only received 2 reviews, and it really needs more. Podcast platforms operate on an algorithm the same way that social media does. And the algorithm favors podcasts that have people subscribe to it and that have reviews. And getting them on a regular basis is important. The more reviews and subscribers I have, the more often the podcast will be suggested when people are looking for a podcast. So please, I know that it's a big ask. It's going to take time, but I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate, review, and share the podcast in groups anywhere that parents who need it will see it. Most parents find me through the podcast being shared. So thank you in advance for using your valuable time to help me with that. Back to acceptance. In coaching, there's this place called the river of misery. That is where you get stuck when you're resisting change or resisting reality. Acceptance gets you to the other side of the river. But until then, you're in the middle of that river, swimming against the current, water splashing in your face, thinking the current needs to change directions, and completely exhausted from all that hard work. Acceptance is really easy to talk about, but very hard to actually do. And yet, it's absolutely critical if we want to move forward in a healthy way, not just in our relationships with our kids, but also for ourselves and our overall quality of life. That is important here that our lives matter. And living a happy, healthy, high quality life is helping your child. Let's start with why acceptance is so important. Acceptance is at the core of peace. My program is named, my group coaching program for moms is named the Peace of Mind program because that's what I hear parents say that they want quite often is peace. Acceptance is at the center of peace. In that moment, when you finally release your grip on how you think things should be and instead say, okay, this is where I'm at. This is what's happening right now. And then from there, you can start to make decisions based on reality, not fear, not anger, not shoulds, but reality, what's actually happening. When we resist acceptance, we're stuck in the problem. We're stuck in the past, stuck in the hurt, and stuck in all of the what ifs. That resistance comes at a great cost to us. We're paying the price of not being in acceptance of what is actually happening. Emotionally, we end up carrying the weight of things that we can't control. It eats away at our energy, our joy, our relationships. We miss out on the beauty of the present moment because we're clinging so tightly to how we thought life was going to be. And let's be honest, this resistance is exhausting. The mental gymnastics of trying to force something or someone to be different than they are wears us down. At its core, acceptance contributes to psychological flexibility, which is the ability to stay open and adaptable in the face of difficult emotions, thoughts, or life situations. Psychological flexibility allows us to focus on what we can do in the moment to move toward a richer, more meaningful life, even if that moment is filled with discomfort. But I want to make sure that I make this one thing clear. Acceptance does not, it does not mean that you like what is happening. It doesn't mean that you agree with it, and it doesn't mean that you're giving up. Sometimes people think if I accept this situation, it means that I am condoning it or I am okay with it. But that is not what acceptance is. It is not resignation. It is not saying, I'm okay with this. It's saying, this is what's happening right now. It's acknowledging the situation without judgment So you can make decisions from a place of clarity and in alignment with your values and who you want to be in this difficult situation. So let's define acceptance clearly. Acceptance is the ability to acknowledge the reality of your situation without trying to change it in that moment. It's about seeing things as they are, not as you wish they were. And from there, you can decide what to do next. Acceptance is actually very empowering because it allows you to step out of the struggle and into a space where you can choose how you respond intentionally. Now, I recognize that this is easier said than done. And I know some of you listening might be thinking, how do I even begin to accept this situation with my child, especially since it feels so painful? And I just want to offer that I have gone through this myself, so I realize the difficulty and I understand the amount of work it takes, but it is so worth it. That's why today I am going to share 3 steps that you can take towards acceptance. And this is really about just moving towards forgiveness as well, forgiveness for yourself and for others. That is part of that acceptance process. And I have a podcast episode about forgiveness as well. Before I share those 3 steps, I have to add that part of my journey to acceptance was grieving. And I'm not talking about the grief I experienced after Helena passed away. I'm talking about the grief that came from ambiguous loss when she was still alive. Ambiguous loss is a loss that is unclear or unconfirmed and can lead to deep feelings of sadness, confusion, and anxiety. It can occur when a person's physical presence remains, but the emotional connection is lost, or when the emotional connection remains, but the physical connection is lost. Some examples of ambiguous loss include a loved one who is missing or presumed dead, but no body has been found, a person with dementia who is physically present but may not be mentally or emotionally present, a loved one who is incarcerated, but the family still worries about their safety and never knows what that person is going through, and they can't see them as often as they would like to. A partner who has emotionally checked out from a relationship, friends, lovers, and families who drift from each other or become estranged, or in our case, a child who is struggling with substance use. I grieved the loss of my hopes and dreams for Helena's life and the loss of my hopes and dreams for my experience as a mother and the loss of the kind of relationship that I hoped to have with her. I can still remember going through boxes of her stuff that I had kept when she was younger. It was all of her gymnastics awards, her baby book, drawings, all of those things, just looking through them, longing for those times when things were so much easier and grieving that they were long gone. And I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that it wasn't going to be what I had hoped for when I was pregnant and this little being was growing inside me and kicking me and constantly had the hiccups. None of us goes into having a baby thinking that the baby will be so distraught by life that they get lost in their substance use. I would also sit in her room and hold her stuffed bunny and just let the tears flow. That was some of my intentional grieving process. I think it's a very personal thing. That was just part of it. Your grieving process might look very different, and that's okay. You just have to listen to your instincts about what feels right for you. But that grieving process was a really important part of me reaching acceptance. My question to you is, have you grieved yet? Have you acknowledged and spent time with your ambiguous loss? If you haven't, then consider what this grieving process might look like for you. After I finished, well, I don't want to say finished grieving, but after I got well into it and acknowledged it, then came acceptance. This happened around the time Helena was 17. And my main thought about acceptance was it was a thought of acceptance, and it was very simple, was that my daughter might not ever change. That was what I was accepting. Things might always be as they were at that time. She might be that way for the rest of her life. And if she was always that way, her life would probably be short. So, do I want to spend my time resisting who she is and needing her to change? Or do I want to make the most of what I have available to me? I had to lean into difficult emotions and situations that I was experiencing with Helena with openness and curiosity rather than pushing them away in order to do that. That allowed me to live in the present moment, even when that moment was challenging. But that's how I was able to act in alignment with my values rather than being driven by avoidance and fear. I went all in on working with reality instead of resisting it. And I am full of gratitude today that I was given that opportunity to show up in that way, to be that kind of mom. And I'm grateful that I took the opportunity and ran with it, and that I get to be proud of myself today because of that. My daughter got to experience what it was like to have me love her unconditionally and accept her during the hardest moments. So I mentioned earlier there's three steps to acceptance. There's a lot of S's in there or S sounds. Step number one is to name what you're feeling. Acceptance is an active and ongoing process. As I've mentioned a couple of times, I want to push that point home. That is not a passive event. You're not going to arrive there. It's going to ebb and flow. But in order to reach that acceptance, you have to turn towards some uncomfortable feelings and lean into them. That means getting honest with yourself about what you are feeling. I mean, really honest. This isn't about what you think you should feel or what other people say you should feel. It's about what's truly going on inside of you. Are you angry, sad, scared, frustrated, resentful, judging? Bring on all the ugly thoughts and feelings. When I'm working with someone, those quote unquote ugly thoughts and feelings start with them saying something like, I know this sounds awful, but, or a mom shouldn't feel this way, but if you find yourself thinking those forbidden, I'm air quoting again, even though you can't see me, air quoting the word forbidden thoughts, get in there and explore those forbidden thoughts. You can't move through what you don't acknowledge. So if you resist those thoughts, you can't work through them and they're going to keep trying to come up. You got to acknowledge, embrace the ugly. It's hard to accept what you don't understand or haven't made peace with, but you don't have to understand it to make peace with it, which I know that's a mouthful. So here's a story about that. When Helena, she used to stretch her earlobes with gauges. Initially, it drove me crazy because I didn't understand why she was doing it. And I saw it as a part of a larger problem with her rebelliousness. I never understood it, but I made peace with it because, in the grand scheme of things, it was a safe personal expression. And I wanted to love and accept her for who she was, gauges and all. So I didn't have to understand it to accept it. Pain is a natural part of life, but suffering comes from our attempts to resist or escape that pain. When we accept our discomfort, we reduce its power over us. So, in review of step one, name the emotions, write them down or say them out loud, whatever works for you. Just allow yourself to acknowledge and feel what's there, no matter what it is. Don't shut it down anymore. Step number two, separate facts from story. This one can be tricky, but it's important. We all have stories that we tell ourselves about what's happening in our lives. Facts are arguable in a court of law. Think of it like that, and aren't full of emotional words. Stories are our interpretations of things rather than facts. Some story examples are: my child will never change. If they loved me, they wouldn't do this. I'm failing as a parent, or this is just a phase. Nothing is changing or nothing is working. Those are stories, not facts. And I've heard all of those many times. Some facts are: my daughter is using substances. That's a fact. Another one is my first try at that new communication skill didn't create the result that I hoped for. That's a fact rather than the story about that would be nothing is changing and nothing is working, right? Very different from my first attempt at trying a new communication skill didn't create the result that I hoped for. Another fact: my son hasn't contacted me in 3 days. By separating the facts from the stories, you give yourself the clarity to see what is really happening. This is about embracing reality. This is where you start to reduce the weight of expectations that things should be different and reducing the disappointment that they aren't different. Part of my acceptance and moving from my story into facts was when Helena was 16, she was stealing from my husband a lot, money, whatever she could get her hands on, but never from me, which I know technically because we were married, it was ours, but she was always taking money out of his wallet, his nightstand, or his car, but never mine. The day that she finally stole from me snapped me into reality and acceptance of where we were. And my reality started to align with the situation when we were standing outside the credit union talking to the police officer because she had stolen one of my checks and taken it to the bank and tried to cash it. And they called me, and the police officer talked to both of us. And I just remember standing there like my brain was catching up with where we were. There was no way I could deny it anymore. But before that, I was still looking for every possible sign that my story about my sweet, dependable baby girl, that she was going to come back to me and this was just a phase. Part of I had an investment in believing that story. The investment in believing that story was that everything was going to be okay and I wasn't going to have to continue looking to figure out what I could do to support her. So that story made sense. And there's probably reasons that your stories make sense as well. But overall, they aren't serving you. So my story kept me from facing that uncomfortable reality that this was much more than just a phase. So that was step number two, separating the facts from your stories. That's part of acceptance. And the third part of acceptance is practicing self compassion. Acceptance isn't just about accepting your child or the situation, they are part of it. But it is also about accepting yourself. It's always easy, easier, it was easier for me to practice these concepts that I was learning as I was learning to support my daughter, to practice them on myself. So, accepting that you are a human being trying to navigate a really tough situation, that you are not perfect, and that is okay. Forgiveness starts with you. So, be kind to yourself. Understand that you're doing the best you can in a situation that doesn't come with a manual. We didn't leave the hospital with a book that had a chapter in it that taught you craft or invitation to change when your child started struggling with substance use. If you're like me, it took you 4 years or 5 years to find that. But when you can show yourself compassion for things like that, it becomes easier to extend that same compassion toward others, including your child. So if you practice it on yourself, it's easier to use compassion on others. And that brings us to forgiveness again. Forgiveness isn't about letting somebody off the hook or saying what they did is okay. It's about freeing yourself from that bitterness and resentment that builds up when you're holding on to that pain. It's about releasing yourself from that emotional prison. Self forgiveness and forgiveness of others is an act of self compassion. There are three specific elements of self compassion: there's self kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness. Self kindness is that kind inner voice like you would have for a friend or a toddler. For me, like I'll put my hand on my heart and just be like, wow, Heather, this really sucks. I will talk out loud to myself. I don't care if anybody sees me or hears me. But that's that kind inner voice that I practice with myself, or I guess out loud voice. Common humanity is remembering that everyone experiences pain and anyone else in your situation would be struggling too. So you were not alone in this experience of pain in this human life. The mindfulness aspect of self compassion involves being present with your emotions and experiences without judgment, acknowledging them as they are. So rather than suppressing or exaggerating them, which that really applies to acceptance as well. It is being present with what's happening without judgment, acknowledging it as it is, and not suppressing it or exaggerating it. Those are the three steps of self compassion. And again, the three steps to help you with acceptance are one, naming your emotions, two, separating facts from stories, and three, practicing self compassion. You might not feel like acceptance or forgiveness is possible right now, and that's okay. Just take it one step at a time. Even small steps toward it are progress. I want to remind you one more time that acceptance isn't a one time event. Don't set yourself up for that, thinking that once you feel acceptance, you won't go back. That's not how it works. It's an ongoing process, it ebbs and flows. Sometimes you feel greater levels of acceptance than others. The goal is just to continue building on that acceptance foundation. And these aren't the only three steps to forgiveness, but they can help get you started. Just remain open and curious. There are other ways that you can get to acceptance. If this doesn't resonate with you, do some research and find what does, because you're going to benefit from that research and that work on yourself. And in turn, as a byproduct, your child will benefit from it too. That is it for today. Thank you for listening to this episode. I hope that this episode gives you some things to think about and, more importantly, something to work on. And I just want to remind you that you are not alone in this. If you need support, you can sign up for a Road to Recovery call with me, and we will talk through how I can help you, how I can meet you where you're at in your unique situation, and help you figure out what you believe is best for yourself and your family, following your values. And if you would like to sign up for that call, the link is in the show notes.